Hi everyone, and welcome back to MCM 345 Social Media and Digital Strategy. In our first class, we focused mostly on the big picture. We've talked about digital marketing, the customer journey, different types of touch points and media, and the importance of integrating different communication activities into a larger strategy. Now, starting from today, we are going to just begin breaking the big picture into smaller pieces and looking more closely at how we can actually develop a digital strategy. And as you can see here, the first step is research. Because before we can decide what brand should do, we firstly need to understand where it is now. So let's get it started. All right, so why research first? When organizations think about digital communication, there can be a temptation to jump immediately to tactics like should we start a TikTok account? Should we work with the influencers? Things like that. But those questions are difficult to answer strategically unless we first understand the situation, and that's why we need research. Research can help us to understand a lot of things. First of all, the situation, which means the larger environment in which the organization operates. What is happening in the market, what trends are affecting the organization, and what competitors are doing. These factors can create both opportunities and challenges for our organization. And also, we need to understand the organization or the brand itself. So, what does it do? Okay, what are its goals or strengths or weaknesses? And in this class, we mostly focus on things like how does it currently communicate with its audience, and what kind of digital presence does it have already? Before proposing something new, we need to really understand where the brand is currently standing. The next one is the audience. Excuse me. So, the audience are important. We need to understand who we are trying to reach and what matters to them. What do they really care about? What problems or what needs do they have? So, we are going to spend much more time on audience research later this semester. But audience understanding is just a very essential part of our research process. Ultimately, we conduct research because strategy involves making choices. The organizations have, limited time, money, and resources, so they cannot do everything. And research gives us evidence for make a decision. Okay, so what problems deserve attention right now? What opportunities are worth pursuing? And which group of audiences should we prioritize? And eventually, which strategies and tactics make the most sense at this time? So please remember, we should always follow this path. Research first, because research can give us all that information. And once we've collected information, we analyze the information to identify some insights, which means something meaningful, okay? Something meaningful that can just help us to understand the problem or the opportunities. And then those insights inform our strategy, which means the overall approach we decided to take. And once we chose specific strategy, we can decide specific tactics. Okay, the things that we actually gonna do. For example, if you're working for the organization, you shouldn't say things like, oh, let's just use TikTok because TikTok is popular today. Research might show us that our target audience spends significant time on TikTok and responds particularly well to short educational videos. And because of that, well, that is an insight, okay? And that insight could support a strategy that focuses particularly on reaching and educating and that audience through the short form video, and that is a strategy. And because of that strategy, we can make specific tactics of using TikTok. So TikTok becomes one of the possible tactics. So that's how we decide, okay? That's how we make the decisions. Okay, once we understand why research matters, the next question is, where does our information really come from? So that brings us to the two types of research, the primary research and secondary research. The key differences is whether we are collecting some new information ourselves or are we using the information that already exists. So primary research. Primary research means you need to collect the new information. It involves collecting original data firsthand for a particular research purpose or goals. So in other words, we have a question, okay, and we need to answer. We need to have this question answered, so we go directly to people or to situations to gather the information that can help us to answer the question. And this would include things like conduct a survey, sending out questionnaire, do some in-depth interviews. Maybe you can organize certain focus groups, having a group of people coming to a specific place to discuss a specific topics, and maybe it comes from direct observation. Maybe you can conduct some online experiments. So all of these are the primary research methods, okay? So the key here is to collect new information by yourself. And I would say primary research have advantages and disadvantages. So the major advantage of primary research is that it can be designed around our specific questions and needs. So for example, if you have a specific question, let's say you work for a brand, okay, and you wanted to know its customers' social media using habits. So you could just survey your customer and ask them which social media platforms do they often use, what types of content they prefer on social media, things like that. Okay, you can directly send out your questionnaire and just collecting this information by yourself. And you also have more control over what information you collect and from whom. Okay, so that's the advantage. However, as you could imagine, this type of research requires more time, money, expertise, and access to participants. So that means the primary research is not always the first and the most practical option because it's really, really time and effort consuming. And you might end up sending out 1,000 questionnaires and you have only, dozens of questionnaires get back. Okay, so it's not the first or the most practical option to collect information. And that brings us to the secondary research, which basically means using existing information. Secondary research means you can work with information that has already been collected by other people. So that information may come from outside of your organization, like coming from industry reports or government statistics. It could come from academic research, published papers or news articles, some kind of market reports, or just coming from websites or social media. It can also come from inside of the organization. So things like previous research or the sales records, the website or social media analytics, customer database or report. So the point here is Secondary doesn't mean it is less important. It simply means that information already exists, okay? And I would say always start with secondary research. And I'm going to explain that next. Okay, always start with secondary research. So, in most strategic research projects, secondary research should be our starting point. And the reason is very simple. We should first find out what is already known before collecting new data ourselves. There may already be useful information out there just available for us, which can answer some or just even the most of our questions. Secondary research is also generally, I'd say, faster, easier, and definitely less expensive than conducting primary research. With secondary research, much of the information has already been collected, and our job is just to find it, evaluate, and interpret it. Secondary research also can help us to develop a broad understanding of the situation before we ask more specific questions. So we can learn about the market, the organization, and your competitors, and maybe some other aspects of the environment. And from there, we can identify what we still don't know. And that's the information gaps. And those information gaps can then guide primary research if some additional data collection is necessary. So please remember, this is the basic research process. You should always start with what already exists, okay, the secondary research, and then identify what is missing, the information gap, and then collect new data if necessary, which is the primary research. Okay, 4 categories of marketing research. So we know that we generally begin with secondary research, but what should we actually research? Well, marketing research can be broadly organized into 4 categories. The industry research, which look at the broader market, the industry, and the environment. The product research, which focuses on the brand itself, focus on the organization's products or services. Customer research that can help us to understand the people we're trying to reach. And communication research, which examines how the organization and its competitors communicate with the audience. So these categories, they're all connected, okay? We cannot develop a strong digital strategy by looking at only one piece of the picture. So together, this research helps us to answer where we are now, who we are trying to reach, and what communication opportunities do we have. So let's look at them one by one. Okay. So the first category is industry research. Industry research helps us to understand the larger environment in which an organization operates. No organization operates in isolation. It is always influenced by what is happening around it, the environment. So there are a few things we can just take a look at. The market size and structure, how big the industry is and how it is organized. Is it dominated by a few large companies like airlines, or does it have thousands of small businesses like local restaurants? The competitors and leading brands. So you should identify the major players and understand what they are doing, okay? What they are doing and what they do well. Who sets the standard for the industry and who is losing market share? Well, you don't want to copy competitors blindly, but you can learn from them, learn from their success and mistakes. The emerging trends. So just watching for the new customer behaviors, preferences, or maybe the technologies that could change the industry. So for example, the AI chatbots, okay? So this is something that is pretty much everywhere, okay? All the companies are trying to adopt it. And Also, the new product development and technological advancement. So just track innovations, new products entering the market, and new technologies like AI. If companies can adopt them early, then they can stay relevant. And those who ignore the new trends and technologies might just fall behind. So, industry research or market research, this is not a major focus of this class. This is a much larger topic, and you could easily have an entire class focused just on the market and industry research. And I'm not a marketing professor as well, so we are not going to go deeply into things like market analysis here. But I do want you to keep this in your mind. When developing a digital strategy, we should always have some understanding of the environment in which the organization operates and keep up with important industry and market trends. You don't need to become a market researcher, but you should always be asking what is happening there, okay? What is happening around the organization, and could any of these changes affect our digital strategy, okay? Always keep that in your mind. Okay, so the second one is product research. After understanding the broader environment, we need to start focus on our product. And here, product can refer to a physical product, or it could be a service or just anything else an organization offers to its customers. We want to understand what exactly we are offering and why should customers care about it. So knowing the product itself is not enough. We need to understand how consumers perceive it. Okay, so what do they like? What do they dislike? And why might they choose our product over some other alternatives? So sometimes, what the company believes is greatest strength, it's not always or it's not necessarily what customers value most. So this is important because good communication, a good digital communication should be built around the real customer value, not simply a list of features of our products. And product research help us to identify, what is worth communicating and potentially what needs to be improved in our communication. Okay, so the third category is consumer research. Who are the people we are trying to reach and serve? Ultimately, a digital strategy is designed for people. So we need to understand those people before making any decisions about what to communicate and where to communicate it. So, what do we want to know? Well, we need to know a lot of things beyond demographics. So we need to know who they are, the basic characteristics, and customer profiles. And we also need to know what they do, so their purchasing behaviors and some other relevant behaviors. We need to know why they are doing it. So that means we need to know their needs, their motivations, attitudes, lifestyles, and values, and what kind of problems they're experiencing. So, what are the pain points of our customers? Okay, what are some needs that are met or not satisfied? And last but not least, what kind of media they use. Okay, so what platforms they use, what type of content they prefer, and how they search for information. We will be focusing on consumer research in week 3 and 4. We are going to discuss our audience, like what are the specifics about the digital audiences. We'll be talking about audience segmentation and the customer personas. For now, please just remember the basic idea. Effective strategy begins with understanding the people on the other side of the communication. The last category is communication research, and this one is especially important for today's class. So here, we want to understand how an organization is currently communicating with its audience. Before we develop a new digital strategy, we really need to understand what the organization is already doing. So, in general, communication research should look across the organization's different communication channels like the website, the social media accounts, email and newsletters, the advertising, the traditional or legacy media, and other online and offline communication. So, we want to get a full picture of the brand's current communication presence. And within the audit, we might ask different questions like what channels and platforms is the organization prioritize and why? And what kind of content does it publish? What messages does it emphasize? This can help us to identify strengths, weaknesses, the gaps, and opportunities in the organization's current communication plan. And don't forget your competitors. Communication research should not just focus only on our own organization. We also wanted to know how our competitors are doing, how they communicate with similar audiences. Competitors can help us to understand what is common in our industry, what seems to be working, and where might there be an opportunity to do something different. So, communication research can be quite broad. Ideally, we want to examine all of the organization's existing communication channels, both online and offline, to understand how the organization currently communicate with its audience. But because this class focuses specifically on social media and digital strategy, we are going to narrow our focus to the digital side of the media. Okay, so next I would like to introduce a practical research tool called Digital Presence Audit. Okay, so a digital presence audit is just a systematic review of how an organization currently appears and communicates across its digital channels. So instead of looking at one social media post or just one web page, we take a step back and look at the organization's overall digital presence. And a comprehensive digital audit can include many different areas: the website, the social media, the email, paid advertising, search, and analytics and performance data. So, as this graphic shows, a full digital audit can become quite extensive, but we are not going to conduct every type of audit shown here. For example, the analytics and performance measurement will be covered in a different class, which is called Digital Media Analytics. In this class, our focus is more strategic. Okay, so we'll be focusing on where is the brand currently present, how it is communicating, what kind of content it is using, and what appears consistent or missing or potentially worth improving. The goal is not simply to collect information about every digital channel. The goal is to understand the brand's current digital presence well enough to make better strategic decisions for our plan. So, when we examine a brand's digital presence, one useful place to start with is the Content Hub. So, a content hub is a centralized digital place where the organization publishes, organizes, or provides access to its content. So, you might think of it as some kind of home base for the brand's content. Well, depending on the organization, a content hub might take different formats. The blog posts or articles, it could be videos or podcasts. It could be guides or reports, news and announcements, or some other educational, promotional, or just entertaining content. And large organizations may have a dedicated website or platform, but smaller organizations may simply use a section of their main website. So the example I have here for you is Oracle's modern marketing blog. And as you can see from the slide, Oracle brings different marketing related content together in this one organized destination. And visitors can browse different topics and formats and continue exploring related content. When conducting a digital presence audit, the Content Hub can tell us a lot about the organization. What topics does the brand talk about? What types of content does it produce? And how frequently does it publish? Who does the content appear to be for? And how easy is the content to find and navigate? So we're not just asking, does the organization have a blog? We are beginning to examine how its content ecosystem is organized and presented to our audience. Well, there is one distinction I want you to understand is that not every brand website serves the same purpose. And here we have two websites from the same brand, Lululemon, but they serve very different functions. If you search Lululemon using Google, and probably, I mean, like 90% of the chance, you will be seeing the website on the right. This is the online store. Okay, so shop.lululemon.com. This is Lululemon's online store, which shows the products and drive purchases. So the primary purpose here is pretty much transactional. Okay, so you can browse different products, compare the different options, check prices, and make a purchase eventually. So the design here is heavily focused on the products and conversion. However, on the left, you have the corporate.lululemon.com. Well, the focus of this website is very different. Instead of leading you to buy something, the website provides information about the organization itself, its purpose, values, missions, its business, the social and environmental impact, and company news and other information. So there is a media section in the top menu. I have it circled here. So it shows like our stories, press release, and media inquiries. So the primary purpose of this website is more informational and communicative. So a content hub can take different forms depending on the organization and its communication goals. For large corporations like Lululemon, they might have dedicated website for its content, which is separated from its online shop. However, not all organizations can afford a separate website for its content. So when we say content hub, do not always assume that every organization has a large, dedicated content platform like Lululemon. The form of content hub often depends on the size, the resources, and communication needs of the organization. A smaller business may simply have a blog where it publishes most of its content, and a blog here serves as the content hub on the, I would say, smaller scale, okay, allowing the business to still publish some articles and provide values to their audience, like tutorials, the product's tips, or industry insights. Some organizations may just rely on the social media platforms like Instagram or Facebook to publish and distribute content. They may not even have, resources or even need to build a separate content platform. So the important question here is not, does the organization have a specific website designed for its content? You can just ask, where does most of its content live? Okay, so where can audience regularly find this content, and how is that content organized and connected to its other digital channels? So think of the Content Hub once again as the home base for the brand's content, okay? But that home base can look very different from one organization to another. Okay, let's assume the brand has a dedicated website for its content. Then we're going to have a website audit. A website audit is a systematic review of how well an organization's website is doing its job. Remember, a website is usually one of the most important owned media channels for the organization. So we are asking whether it can effectively communicate with their audiences and supports organizational goals. So we're going to look at several things starting from the content. So look at what information the website provides. Is the content useful and relevant to the target audience? Is it accurate and up to date? Is it clear and easy to understand? Also think about navigation. So consider how easily the visitors can move through the website. So can they quickly find important information, or are the menus or categories and links organized logically? The mobile experience. So remember that many people today just encounter website on their phones rather than on the desktop computer. So just check whether the website adapts well to the smaller screens. The site performance. So we can also look at the basic website performance. Does the site load quickly? Do pages, links, videos, and other features work properly? Things like that. The search visibilities. So this will be something we talked about in the search section later this semester. So whether people can actually find the website and its content through search. Are page titles and content clear enough for both users and search engines to understand what the page is actually about? So we will be introducing something called, SEO, search engine optimization. We'll also be talking about search strategies later this semester. For now, you can just recognize it as an important part of the website audit. The visual and brand consistency. So this is more like a visual part. Look at how the website represents the brand. Are the colors, fonts, images, or messaging consistent? And does the website feel like one coherent brand experience rather than just a whole collection of different unrelated pages? So we won't be practicing everything here for now because, well, as you can see, this is a lot, and some of these things we have not yet introduced. Okay, so we'll be introducing some of these later this semester, and I would say for now we'll be focusing on the content. Okay, let's talk about social media audit. This is a major part of today's class and also for your assignment. So after reviewing the website, another major part of digital presence audit is the brand's social media presence. A social media audit gives us a snapshot of the brand's current social media activities. We wanted to understand what the brand is doing already and how audiences are responding on social media. So we can start with the most basic question, where is the brand? And that is platform presence. You should identify which platforms the organization currently uses, including things like Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, X, Threads, and some others, okay, all the social media presence. And also notice whether some accounts appear to be active, inactive, or maybe just abandoned. Simply having an account doesn't necessarily mean that the platform is part of the active strategy. Second, audience size. So we should look at the size of the brand's existing audience. How many followers, subscribers, or community members does it have on each platform? These numbers give us a basic sense of the brand's existing reach. But remember, a larger audience does not automatically mean a more effective social media presence. We should also take account of the engagement rate. The next one is activity. So, how actively the brand uses each platform. How frequently does it post, and is the posting schedule relatively consistent, or are there long periods of inactivity? And this can help us to understand how much attention the organization currently gives to each platform. The content. So we should look beyond frequency and examine what the brand actually posts. So what topics does it talk about, and what formats does it use? The photos, images, short form videos, long form videos, stories, links, educational posts, promotional posts, entertaining posts, things like that. Okay, so are there recognizable content themes or patterns? We also want to see how audience respond, so the engagement. Are people liking or commenting or sharing, maybe reposting, or just otherwise interacting with the content in any way? So which type of posts or which type of content seem to generate more responses than others? At this stage, we are looking for some basic patterns, and we are not going to do detailed data analytics. I mean, we can do that, but it's not part of the class. We're just looking for some basic patterns based on the observations. Cross-platform consistency. This basically means that because brands often use multiple platforms, we should look at them together rather than separately. Okay, so is the brand identity recognizable across different platforms? And are the same messages simply copied everywhere, or does the brand could do something to adapt its content to different platforms? And remember, consistency does not mean that everything have to be identical. Okay, so a brand can maintain a consistent identity, but also find a way to adapt to different platform cultures and audiences and community values, etc., etc. And finally, we need some context. So just looking at one particular brand does not tell us whether its social media presence is strong or weak. We need to have some context. We need to compare it with a few similar organizations or competitors. Okay, so just take a look at your competitors' social media presence, which platforms are they using, what kind of content are they creating, and how active are they, and how people responded to them. So this can help us to identify both the industry norms and potential opportunities. All right, I'm going to give you an example about social media audit, and this example comes from a previous student project in my class. This group selected Owala and developed an integrated marketing communication plan for the brand. And this is part of their final presentation at the end of the semester, the digital presence audit part, particularly the social media audit. So I'm not showing you their entire presentation, but I wanted to give you an idea about how the social media audit is conducted. So they've done the social media audit across 7 different social media platforms, and notice that they did not just simply list which platforms Owala uses. For each platforms, they look at different things. Let me show you. So the first one is Instagram. And the students find that Instagram had Owala's largest audience and largest amount of content among the platforms they examined. So this many followers and this many posts. They also identified the dominant formats, the images, graphics, reels, and they were not just saying like Owala has an Instagram. They were also asking what role does Instagram appear to play in Owala's overall social media presence. So what is Instagram's strength? Okay, so it says here Instagram's strength, it has sweatable images and long expandable texts. And Owala appears to be able to write more and include more images. So, what is Instagram's strength, okay, and how Owala was able to take advantage of this feature? Their observations suggest that Instagram was the major content hub for this brand. And the next platform is TikTok. Sorry. And TikTok once again has this many followers and this many posts. And Owala had a substantial audience and hundreds of posts. So simply look at the follower or post counts might suggest that the brand was very active there. But the students looked deeper and they noticed that much of the content was recycled from Instagram Reels. So they argued that Owala was not taking full advantages of some characteristics associated with this particular platform. Okay, no viral posts, influencer commentary, or memes. So the next platform is X, which is also known as Twitter. So once again, we have a screenshot, we have some content, some data. So on X, the students noticed a different communication function, a great balance of recycled content, also exclusive product announcements on apps. So Owala used this platform for product announcements, but also for timely responses to customer issues such as sold out products and back orders. So the important insights is not simply that Owala uses apps. This platform appears to serve a somewhat different role in this brand's communication ecosystem. However, as you can see, the last point is there's still underutilization of text-based replies, post, and repost. So there's some limitations as well. Okay, so the next platform is YouTube. And the students separated Owala's shorts from its traditional horizontal videos. And they found that the shorts were used relatively well, but the longer form YouTube content was much less developed. So they have 152 vertical videos and 51 horizontal videos spread across 4 years. So that is a big underutilization of YouTube's primary content, okay? And the post frequency is low, and Owala doesn't use the long form content, interesting titles, etc., etc. So this is another example of how a social media audit can help us to identify a gap or underutilized opportunity. We are still not developing a strategy yet, but now we have some evidence, okay, some evidence that could inform a strategy later. So the next platform is Pinterest. And on Pinterest, the students first documented basic presence. Okay, we have about 4,000 followers and just 34 posts at the time of their audit. So it's just, at the beginning. Again, the numbers are not only, the numbers are just only the starting point. They also examined what the content actually looked like. And Owala relied heavily on high quality product photography, the colorful products, and relatively clean backgrounds. So there's a pattern, okay, in their posts. The captions also provided the product information and often included a call to action. So CTA, that's call to action, which makes sense because Pinterest can help users to move from product discovery toward a brand or shopping destination. And one particularly useful observation here was that many of these images were exclusive to Pinterest rather than simply copied from another platform. And this tells us something about this platform adaptation. The brand appears to recognize that Pinterest is highly visual and discovery oriented, so they create content accordingly. They have some content specifically for this particular platform. That is a strategy. All right, so the next platform is Facebook. So on Facebook, they have this many followers. I mean, 64K followers. That's quite a few, and over 200 posts. So yeah, this is a much larger existing audience, a larger volumes of content. Owala used Facebook heavily for product announcements and launches, particularly for the new colors and collections. They also noticed that the campaigns sometimes unfolded across several posts over a short period of time. So, for example, spread over a week. And the content included both images and videos, usually accompanied by the captions and call to actions. But the students did not stop just describing what Owala posted. They also evaluated how well the content seemed to fit the platform. And their conclusion was that some of the content appeared less specifically adapted to Facebook. They said content is less aligned with Facebook, less memes, and less serious tones. This is because during the lecture, in that semester, which is something we'll do later this semester as well, we are going to talk about different audiences, user characteristics, and the different characteristics of different platforms. So we say the majority of Facebook users today are middle-aged or even older, so sometimes the communication tones can be a little bit more formal, but it's not a rigid rule. Okay, it's not a rigid rule, but please remember Facebook, it has a relatively strong community and relationship building orientation, so there was relatively limited use of this feature for Owala, so content appears to less tailored for the Facebook's audience and community oriented environment. And lastly, we have Threads, and this is relatively new. At the time of the audit, Owala had 48.4K followers, but only 21 posts. So this is very interesting. There is an audience there, but relatively little brand activity. And the students also noticed that the posts tended to follow formats similar to Instagram. Okay, short announcements, the brief captions, and call to actions. So, based on these observations, the students described Threads as underutilized. Whether Owala should invest more heavily in Threads is a strategic question that requires maybe additional research. But the audit here has already identified something worth investigating. That is the reason we have social media audits. Alright, so we have just looked at an example about how the social media audit can be conducted. Now, if you were conducting a social media audit yourself, what would the process actually look like? This checklist gives us a more systematic way to approach it. You don't necessarily need to complete every step at the same level of depth. What you can analyze depends partially on what data do you have access to. So number one, list all social media accounts. You need to identify all of the brand's social media accounts and do not assume that the platforms you personally use are the only ones that matter. You should look at Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Pinterest, LinkedIn, X, Threads, and some other relevant platforms. This gives us a basic map of the brand's social media presence. Number two, examine the profiles. You should look at how the brand presents itself on each platform. Is the profile complete? Are the username, the bio, profile image, the links, and other elements consistent with the brand? At this stage, we're asking, does it look and feel like the same brand across different platforms? And step 3 to 5 is basically look at the performance. So ideally, an audit also examines performance in different ways. How large is the audience? How much engagement does the content receive? which posts perform particularly well among all the posts and which platforms appear to work better than others. So some of this information is publicly visible, the follower counts, likes, comments, views, and more detailed metrics usually require access to the organization's analytic tools, but that is not covered in this class. For this class, I do not expect you to conduct a full analytic audit. So there's another class we'll be focusing more specifically on digital media analytics, as I said before. Here, our purpose is primarily to understand the brand's current social media presence and strategy. So you should focus on what you can reasonably observe by yourself. Okay, so where is the brand active? What does it post? How frequently does it post? How do audience appear to respond to the content? How does it approach different? How does it approach? Differ across different platforms, and does the content seem appropriate for each platform? The last step is connect the audit back to strategy. So you need to measure performance against goals, because ultimately an audit isn't just about collecting information and describing what is there. You should also ask, so what? Okay, what seems to be working? What seems to be underutilized? Where are these opportunities for improvement, and what it should do, differently? Okay, what can we do differently to make it better, to get better results? So things like that. So I'd like to talk about this once again, about the difference between quantitative and qualitative audit, because when we conduct a digital or social media audit, we can look at the brand in two ways. Okay, so what is there and is it any good? Okay, so I would say in practice, a useful audit usually include both. We should do a quantitative audit for sure to, begin by creating an inventory of the brand's digital presence. We are primarily just documenting all the observable facts. So on social media, okay, we might record which platforms is there, and the numbers of followers, posts, and posting frequencies, things of that. So all of these are the data, okay, the factual information. So we are asking, what do we see? This is the quantitative part, but we also need to include the qualitative audit. Okay, we need to move beyond simply documenting what exists, and we should begin to evaluate it. We should ask questions like, is the content useful and relevant? Is it consistent with the brand? And does it fit the platform? Okay, and is the brand taking advantages of the platform's strengths, or are there any obvious weaknesses or missed opportunities? So we are moving from description to interpretation, and that's very important because your evaluation is going to inform the strategy, and your evaluation should be supported by evidence rather than personal preferences. All right, that's everything we have for today. In this class, we introduced research as the foundation of digital strategy. We talked briefly about different types of research, and then because this class focused particularly on digital media, we narrowed our attention to the digital presence audit. In particular, we look at how to examine a brand's content hub and how to conduct a basic social media audit. And that brings us to your first project, which is based directly on what we've covered today. Okay, so if we were meeting in person right now, we would have some time in class to work together and practice conducting a digital audit before you started the project on your own. Unfortunately, we are not able to do that at this time. So I just really wanted you to take some time and read the project instructions very, very carefully. I've tried my best to make them as detailed and step-by-step as possible. So they basically walk you through everything I expect you to include in this assignment. For this project, basically, you are going to choose a brand and conduct a basic audit of its digital presence. You will firstly identify and examine its content hub, and then you will conduct a social media audit across its platforms. I've already included a series of questions for each step, so if you work through those questions carefully, they should get you through the project. And one thing I want to emphasize here is that the project goes beyond simply documenting what you find. Of course, I want you to record things like where the brand is active, what kind of content is posted, how frequently it posts, things like that. But I also want you to think about what those observations tell us. Okay, so at the end of the project, you will identify 3 meaningful research insights based on what you've discovered. And you'll have 2 weeks, well, actually more than 2 weeks to work on this project. So don't feel like you need to rush through it. Take your time, explore the brand digital presence, and follow the instructions step by step. Okay, and also be prepared to give a brief informal presentation of your project once we return to our in-person meeting. Nothing too elaborated, okay? You are simply introduce your brand, show us some of the, what you find, and share the most important insights from your audit. If anything in the instructions is unclear, or if you run into questions while you are working, please feel free to send me an email and I'm happy to help. Other than that, I hope you have a great long weekend and I will see you next week.